Alright, guys, I'm back, and British Parliament. British public and government opinions became increasingly opposed to state support for Zionism, and even Sykes has begun to change his views in late 1918. In February 1922, Churchill telegraphed Samuel, who had begun his role as High Commissioner for Palestine 18 months earlier, asking for cuts in expenditure and noting, quote, "In both houses and Parliament there is growing movement of hostility against Zionist policy in Palestine, which will be stimulated by recent Northcliffe articles. I do not attach undue importance to this movement, but it is increasingly difficult to meet the argument that it is unfair to ask the British taxpayer, already overwhelmed with taxation, to bear the cost of imposing on Palestine an utterly unpopular policy." And this seems to make the distinction between Zionism as a concept being separate from Jewish people as a whole. So that's important to maybe imply and note. The House of Lords rejected a Palestine mandate incorporating the Balfour Declaration by 60 votes to 25th after the June 1922 assurance of the Churchill White Paper. Following a motion proposed by Lord Islington, the vote was only symbolic, since it was subsequently overruled by a vote in the House of Commons after a tactical pivot and a number of promises by Churchill. In February 1923, after a change in government, Cavendish laid the foundation for a secret review of Palestine policy in lengthy memorandum to the cabinet. It would be idle to pretend that the Zionist policy is other than an unpopular one. It has been bitterly attacked in Parliament and is still being fiercely assailed in certain sections of the press. The ostensible grounds of attack are threefold. 1. The alleged violation of the McMahon pledges. 2. The injustice of imposing upon a country or policy to which the great majority of its inhabitants are opposed. And 3. The financial burden upon the British taxpayer. Okay, so I'm going to assume, again, maybe I'm talking my ass here, but there's this distaste towards Zionism, which I think is being separated from Judaism as a religion. And so Zionism is an idea, not a demographic that they're talking about. And so, modern day, we seem to hear Zionism and connect it to Jews as a demographic. So, what if to give support for Zionism, back then, they had to sort of shuffle in the aspects of that meaning Jewish people. And so people were less and less talking about Zionism as we need to stop doing and using and pushing this ideology on people. And so people stopped pushing and people stopped advocating for anti-Zionism because it started to be propaganda that was Jew hatred, which it's not. It's an idea, it's a thing, it's an ideology you use upon a system. So back then, it's possible that just to have people in the media and elsewhere go easy on Zionism, they needed you to think of the Jews. And so my guess that's how the Christians spun Zionism. Again, putting a scapegoat on the Jewish on Jewish people as a demographic, just to get their Zionist plot to work out. All right. His cover note asks for a statement of policy to be made as soon as possible, and for the cabinet to focus to three questions: 1, whether or not pledges to the Arabs conflict with the Balfour Declaration; 2, if not, whether the government should continue the policy set down by the government in 1922 White Paper; and 3, if not, what alternative policy should be adopted. Stanley Baldwin, who took over as Prime Minister on the 2nd of May 1923 set up a cabinet committee in June 1923 whose terms of reference were to, quote, examine Palestine policy afresh and to advise the full cabinet whether British should remain in Palestine and whether she remained the pro-Zionist policy should be continued. And whether, wait, what? If she remain, oh, the cabinet approved the report of this subcommittee on the 31st of July 1923 when presenting the subcommittee's report to the cabinet. Curzon concluded that, wise or unwise, it is well nigh impossible for any government to extricate itself without a substantial sacrifice or sacrifice of consistency of self-respect, if not honor, describing it as, quote, nothing short of remarkable. International law specialist Professor John B. Quigley noted that the government was admitted to itself that its support for Zionism had been prompted by considerations having nothing to do with the merits of Zionism or its consequences for Palestine. Documents related to the 1923 reappraisal remained secret under the early 1970s. United States. The United States was not a member of the League of Nations. On the 23rd of February 1921, 2 months after the draft mandates had been submitted to the League, the U.S. requested permission to comment before the mandate's consideration by the Council of the League of Nations. The Council agreed to the request a week later. The commissions continued until the 14th of May 1922, whether the U.S. government announced the terms of an agreement with the United Kingdom about the Palestine Mandate. The terms included a stipulation that consent to the United States shall be obtained before any alteration is made in the text of the mandate, despite opposition from the State Department. This was followed by the 21 September 1922 by the Lodge Fish Resolution, a congressional endorsement of the Balfour Declaration. On the 3rd of December 1924, the U.S. signed the Palestine Mandate Convention, a bilateral treaty with Britain in which the United States consents to the administration, Article 1, and which dealt with 8 issues of concern to the United States, including property rights and business interests. The State Department prepared a report documenting its position on the mandate. Council of the League of Nations mandate. On the 17th of May 1922, in a discussion of the date on which the question of the draft mandate for Palestine should be placed on the agenda of the Council of the League of Nations, Lord Balfour informed the Council of his government understandings of the role in the League of the creation of mandates. The mandates were not the creation of the League, and they could not substance but be altered by the League. The League's duties were confined by seeing that the specific and detailed terms of the mandates were in accordance with the decisions taken by the Allied and associated powers, and that in carrying out these mandates, the mandatory powers should be under the supervision, not under the control of the League. A mandate was self-imposed limitations by the conquerors on the sovereignty which they exercised over the conquered territory. The Council of the League of Nations met 19 and 24th of July 1922 to approve the Class A mandates for Palestine and Syria. Minutes of the meetings can be read here. The Palestine Mandate was approved on the 22nd July 1922 at the private meeting of the Council of the League of Nations at St. James Palace in London. Given the British formal international recognition of the position they had held by de facto in the region since the end of 1917 in Palestine and since 1920-21 in Transjordan. The Council stated that the mandate was approved and would come into effect automatically when the dispute between France and Italy was resolved. A public statement confirming this was made by a president of the Council on the 24th of July. With the fascists gaining power in Italy on October 1922, new Italian Prime Minister Mussolini delayed a mandate's implementation. On the 23rd of August 1923, the Turkish Assembly in Ankara ratified the Treaty of Lausanne, by 215 of 235 votes. The Council of the League of Nations determined that the two mandates had come into effect at its 29 September 1923 meeting. The dispute between France and Italy was resolved by the Turkish ratification. Council of the League of Nations Transjordan Memorandum. Shortly after the mandate's approval in July 1922, the Colonial Office prepared a memorandum to implement Article 25. On the 16th of September 1922, the League of Nations approved a British memorandum detailing its intended implementation of the clause excluding Transjordan from the articles related to Jewish settlements. When the memorandum was submitted to the Council of the League of Nations, Balfour explained the background according to the minutes. Quote, Lord Balfour reminded his colleagues that Article 25 of the Mandate for Palestine, as approved by the Council in London on July 24, 1922, provides that the territories in Palestine which lie east of the Jordan should be under a somewhat different regime from the rest of Palestine. The British government now merely proposed to carry out this article. It had always been part of the policy templated by the League and accepted by the British government, and the latter now desired to carry it into effect. The pursuance of the policy embodied in Article 25, Lord Balfour invited the Council to pass a series of resolutions which modified the mandate as regards those territories. The object of these resolutions was to withdraw from Transjordania and special provisions which were intended to approve a national home for the Jews west of the Jordan. Turkey. Turkey was not a member of the League of Nations at the time of the negotiations. As the losing side of World War I, they did not join until 1932. Decisions about mandates over Ottoman territory made by the Allied Supreme Council at the San Remo Conference was documented in the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed on behalf of the Ottoman Empire and the Allies on the 10th of August 1920. The treaty was never ratified by the Ottoman government. However, because it required the government of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk expressed disdain for the treaty and continued what was known as the Turkish War of Independence. The Conference of Lausanne began in November 1922 with the intention of negotiating a treaty to replace the failed Treaty of Versailles. I keep reading this differently. I'm so sorry, guys. Okay. In the Treaty of Lausanne, signed on the 24th of July 1923, the Turkish government recognized the detachment of the regions south of the frontier agreed in the Treaty of Ankara 1921 and renounced its sovereignty over Palestine. National Home for the Jewish People, Preambles, Article 2467, 11. All right, let's see here. According to the second paragraph of the Mandate's Preamble, okay, whereas the principal Allied powers have also agreed that the mandatory should be responsible for putting into effect a declaration originally made on November 2nd, 1917 by the government of His Britannic Majesty and adopted by the said powers in favor of the establishment in Palestine of the national home for the Jewish people, it being clearly understood that nothing should be done which might prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. All right. Wiseman noted in his memoirs that he considered the most important part of the mandate and the most difficult negotiations the subsequent clause in the preamble which recognized the historical connection of the Jews in Palestine. Curzon and the Italian-French governments rejected early drafts of the mandate because of the preamble had contained a passage which read, quote, recognizing, however, the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and the claim which this gives them to reconstitute it their national home. The Palestine Commitment set up the Foreign Office recommended that the reference to the claim be omitted. Of course, that just makes so much sense. You want to word it in a way that's justified and not by force. Okay. The Allies had already noted that the historical connection to the Treaty of Versailles had not acknowledged a legal claim. Lord Balfour suggested an alternative which was accepted and included in the preamble immediately after the paragraph quoted above. Quote, whereas recognition has thereby, i.e. by the Treaty of Versailles, been given to the historical connection of the Jewish people from Palestine, with Palestine, and to the grounds for reconstituting their national home in the country. In that country. I think I said in their country, sorry. Sometimes I just don't know. Okay. In the body of the document, the Zionist organization was mentioned in Article 4 in the September 1920 draft. A qualification was added which required that its organization and constitution must be, quote, in the opinion of the mandatory appropriate. A Jewish agency was mentioned 3 times in Article 4 and 6 and 11. Article 4 of the mandate provided for, quote, the recognition of an appropriate Jewish agency as a public body for the purpose of advising and cooperating with the administration of Palestine in such economic, social, and other matters as may affect the establishment of the Jewish national home and the interests of the Jewish population of Palestine, effectively establishing what became the Jewish Agency for Palestine. Article 7 stated, quote, the administration of Palestine shall be responsible for enacting a nationality law. There shall be included in this law provisions framed so as to facilitate the acquisition of Palestinian citizenship by Jews who take up their permanent residence in Palestine. The proviso to this objective of the mandate was that, quote, nothing should be done to which might prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Religious and communal issues, Articles 13, 16, 24, 23. Religious and communal guarantees, such as freedom of religion and education, were made in general terms which reference to a specific religion. The Vatican and the Italian French governments concentrated their efforts on the issues of the holy places and the rights of the Christian communities, making their legal claims on the basis of the formal protectorate of the Holy See and the French protectorate of Jerusalem. The Catholic power saw an opportunity to reverse the gains made by the Greek and Russian Orthodox communities in the region during the previous 150 years, as documented on the status quo, or in the status quo. The Zionists had limited interest in this area. Britain would assume responsibility for the holy places until Article 13 of the mandate. The ideas of an International Commission to resolve claims on the holy places, formalized in Article 95 of the Treaty of Versailles, was taken up again in Article 14 of the Palestine Mandate. Negotiations about the Commission formation and role were partly responsible for the delay in ratifying the mandate. Article 14 of the mandate required British to establish a commission to study, define, and determine the rights and claims relating to Palestine's religious communities. This provision, which called for the creation of the commission to review the status quo of the religious communities, was not implemented. Article 15 required the mandatory administration to ensure that complete freedom of conscience and the free exercise of all forms of worship were permitted. According to the article, quote, no discrimination of any kind shall be made between the inhabitants of Palestine on the grounds of race, religion, or language. No person shall be excluded from Palestine on the sole grounds of his religious beliefs, end quote. The High Commissioner established the authority of the Orthodox rabbinate over the members of Jewish community and retained the modified version of the Ottoman millet system. Formal recognition was extended to 11 religious communities, which did not include non-Orthodox Jews or the Palestine or the Protestant Christian denominations. All right. Transjordan, Article 25, and Transjordan Memorandum. All right. The public clarification and implementation of Article 25, more than a year after it was added to the mandate, misled some, quote, into imagining that Transjordania territory was covered by the conditions of the mandate as to the Jewish national home before August 1921. This would, according to Professor of Modern Jewish History Bernard Warzenstein, result in the myth of the Palestine's first partition, which became part of the concept of Greater Israel of the ideology of Jabotinsky's revisionist movement, end quote. Palestinian-American academic Abraham Abu Labab, then chair of the Northwestern University Political Science Department, suggested that the, quote, Jordan as the Palestinian state references made by the Israeli spokespeople may reflect the, quote, the same misunderstanding. On the 25th of April 1923, 5 months after the mandate came into force, the independent administration was recognized in a statement made in Amman. Subject to the approval of the League of Nations, His Britannic Majesty will recognize the existence of an independent government in Transjordan under the rule of His Highness the Emir Abdullah, provided that such government is constitutional and places His Britannic Majesty in a position to fulfill his international obligations in respect of the territory by means of an agreement to be concluded with His Highness. Legality. The legality of the mandate has been disputed in detail by scholars, particularly its consistency with Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations. According to the mandate's preamble, the mandate was granted to Britain for the purpose of giving effect to the provision of Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations. That article, which concerns entrusting the tutelage of colonies formerly under German and Turkish sovereignty to advanced nations, specifies communities formerly belonging to the Turkish Empire, which have reached a stage of development where their existence as independent nations can be provisionally recognized, subject to the rendering of the administrative advice and assistance by a mandatory until such time as they are able to stand alone, end quote. During the mandate, Palestinian Arab leaders cited the article as proving their assertion that the British were obliged, under the terms of the mandate, to facilitate the eventual creation of an independent Arab state in Palestine. Sure, you can go by what they are claiming, and it's just factual at that point. It's not inherently so. So, I mean, it is what it is. That's just how that's how anyone could agree with that from the Palestinian side. Like, it either is what it is, or you fight back, you know? That's not to justify terrorism or anything against civilians, because this is, like, the main issue is that civilians on both sides, Jewish citizens, Palestinian citizens, put into the crossfire of this debacle that's been happening for, like, 100 years or less. All right. Borders. Before World War I, the territory, which became mandatory Palestine, was the former Ottoman Empire divisions of the Mudastafarat of Jerusalem and the southern part of Beret Vilayet, which became Transjordan, was the southern Vilayet of Syria and the northern Hajjat Vilayet. During the war, the British military divided the Hejaz and Egyptian expeditionary force threatens of war along a line from a point of southern of Aqaba to point south of Man. The EEF theater was divided between its main theater in Palestine and the Syrian theater, including Transjordan, which was led by Faisal's Arab Revolt Army. The post-war military administration, OETA South and OET East, the latter with an Arab governor split the territory in the same way. Professor Yitzhak Gilhar notes that, quote, the military administration in Palestine always treated Transjordan as a separate administration outside its jurisdiction. In 1955, Professor Uri Ra'anan wrote that the OETA border system, politically if not legally, was bound to influence the post-war sentiment. At a private 13 September 1919 meeting during the Paris Peace Conference, Lloyd George gave Georges Clemenceau a memorandum which said that British Palestine would be defined in accordance with its ancient boundaries of Dan to Beersheba, a biblical concept of Earth's Israel and its reestablishment as a modern state with a basic tenet of the original Zionist program. Chaim Weizmann, leader of the Zionist delegation of the Paris Peace Conference, presented a Zionist statement on the 3rd of February 1919 that declared the Zionist proposed borders and resources essential for the necessary economic foundation of the country, including the control of its river and their headwaters. These borders included present-day Israel and the Israel-occupied territories, western Jordan, southwestern Syria, and the southern Lebanon, in a vicinity of south of Sidon. Neither Palestinians nor any other Arabs were involved in the discussions which determined the boundaries of mandatory Palestine. It makes no sense that Palestinians would want to divvy up their own land like this. So, obviously, like if they were trying to be nice within the face of being colonized and say, oh, well, you can have that over there, I guess, and we'll take this. But no, it just doesn't make sense to have to fucking get on your hands and knees like that. I mean, obviously that's how it's been, even in America. Native Americans just kind of have to take it. They could never really get a huge chunk of land back. I could be wrong on that. I think I read something about Idaho a couple of years ago. Jesus Christ, I'm off topic. Okay. Palestine-Egypt border. The first border, which was agreed, was the British-ruled Egypt. On the 9th of May 1919, a memorandum of the British political delegation to the British Peace Conference stated that the British intended to adopt the border between Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, which was established in 1906. The decision, a compromise between proposals by the Zionists and the British authorities in Egypt, was already well defined on maps. The Negev region was added to Palestine on the 10th of July 1922, after its concession by British Representative John Philby in Transjordan's name. Although not usually considered part of the region of Palestine, the Zionist organization had lobbied for Palestine to be given access to the Red Sea. Abdullah's requests for the Negev to be added to Transjordan in late 1922 to 1925 were rejected. Alright, northern borders. The termination of the mandate southern border was a far longer and more complex process than the other borders. The two primary differences were that this border separated the British-controlled areas, and it had ran through heavily populated areas which had not been separated. The other borders separated British Palestine from British Egypt and British Transjordan ran primarily through sparsely inhabited areas. The northern boundary between British and French mandates was broadly defined by the Franco-British Boundary Agreement of December 1920. This became known as Paulet-Newcombe Agreement for French Lieutenant Colonel Paulet, the British Lieutenant Colonel S.F. Newcombe, who were appointed to the lead of 1923 Boundary Commission to finalize the agreement. It placed most of the Golan Heights in the French sphere and established a joint commission to settle mark the border. Their commission submitted its final report on February 1922. It was approved with some caveats by British and French governments on the 7th of March 1923, several months before British and French assumed their mandatory responsibilities on the 29th September 1923. Under the treaty, Syrian and Lebanese residents would have the same fishing and negotiations rights on Lake, Lake Hula, the Sea of Galilee, and the Jordan River as citizens of mandatory Palestine. But the government of Palestine would be responsible for policing the lakes. The Zionist movement pressured the French and British to include any water resources as possible in Palestine during the demarcation negotiations. The government's demands influenced the negotiations, leading to the inclusion of the Sea of Galilee, both sides of the Jordan River, Lake Hula, the Dan Spring, and part of the Yarmouk River. As High Commissioner of Palestine, Herbert Samuel had demanded full control of the Sea of Galilee. The new border followed a 10-meter wide, 33-foot strip along the northeastern shore, and after the settlement of the northeastern border issue, the British and French governments signed an agreement of good neighborly relations between the mandatory territories in Palestine, Syria, Lebanon on the 2nd of January, February 1926. Okay. All right. I think the general idea is that I believe they just have their land shrinking before them, even as all these treaties are happening. Even if Palestinians and their government went against some treaties, I would still say that they would have the right over their land this is a debate that's still being had. So of course, they have the right to complain about it as it's still a colonial project that can recently be traced back, not even through that many generations. Not even a lot of people have been born between the creation of Israel and what happened to Palestine. So, I mean, it's not even like you can have your citizens in the new generation just forget everything that happened. But for the most part, I still wouldn't say that it makes them hypocrites to go against the treaties. Someone holds a gun to your head and says, hey, let's make a treaty that I own the upstairs of the house while you stay in the basement. And you go against that and you get none of the house and you're the one who looks like the asshole because you didn't just live in the basement while this person holding a gun to your head gets the whole fucking upstairs. Yeah, okay. Dumb example, yeah, I know. But, alright. I'll see you in the next video.